Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. We will now have the inaugural lecture being organized under the UNESCO Chair for Vulnerability Studies hosted at the Department of English. I will now introduce the speaker for the day. Professor Vinod Pavarala is a senior professor at the SN School of Communication. He earned his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh and has taught at the University of Pittsburgh and at IIT Bombay before joining the University of Hyderabad in 1995. He has also been a visiting fellow at Princeton University from 1998 to 1999. He is, as we know, the UNESCO Chair on Community Media and has done pioneering work in the field of community radio, as can be seen in books such as the 2007 co-authored Other Voices, The Struggle for Community Radio in India, and more recently the 2020 book Community Radio in South Asia, Reclaiming the Airwaves. Earlier this year, in June 2022, Professor Pavarala spent a month at Loughborough University, if I'm getting the pronunciation right, in the UK as part of the Duo India Faculty Exchange Fellowship. The UNESCO Chair on Community Media is one of its kind in the world and under the leadership of the chairholder has undertaken several activities, including conducting a series of 11 global dialogues on community media in the post-pandemic world between June and November 2020, which saw the participation of representatives of community media from South and Southeast Asia, the Pacific and Australia, South and Latin America, Africa, the United Kingdom, and continental Europe. In February 2020, Professor Pavarala and Professor Kanchan Malik, who teaches at the same department and is a faculty fellow of the chair, also put together a manual titled Strengthening Gender-Sensitive Practices and Programming in Community Radio to foster and reinforce the best practices, policies, and programming concerning gender in community radio. We are delighted that Professor Pavarala, under whose chairholdership the UNESCO Chair on Community Media has effectively contributed to the field, is the keynote speaker for the inaugural session held by the UNESCO Chair for Vulnerability Studies. Without further ado, may I now invite Professor Vinod Pavarala to talk to us about community media and building resilient communities, addressing multiple vulnerabilities.
Thank you. I appreciate all of you staying back quite late in the day. I actually expected the whole room to leave after the VIPs have left, but I'm glad to see some of you still here, students and colleagues from communication, but also other schools and departments. So I'll try and keep it brief. I think the only condition Pramod had to invite me is the word vulnerability is in the title. I have fulfilled that, Pramod, and a lot of the work the UNESCO Chair on Community Media does is also with certain kinds of vulnerable populations and vulnerable people. I'll talk about it as we go along. Okay, so let me start with 3 or 4 stories, narratives of the kind of people with whom we work and whose lives with the media that we tend to study and to talk about. Let me start with this first of the stories. Ramvati is a tribal woman associated with Radio Dhadkan, a community radio station in a place called Shivpuri in Madhya Pradesh. Founded in 2009, Radio Dhadkan reaches about 51 adjoining villages. The radio focuses mainly on the issues and cultures of the local Saharia community to which she belongs. Ramvati doubles as a producer and as an RJ. In addition to field reporting and studio work, she takes the recorded programs and travels to remote villages where the radio frequency doesn't reach. With the aid of a pen drive, the programs are played at public gatherings, a process that some of us describe as narrowcasting instead of broadcasting. She says, when we talk to her, I talk to Saharians in their own language about their village, their livelihoods, their food, etc., and broadcast them through Radio Dhadkan. Often referred to as the radio woman of Patara, Ramvati says, initially when I went to villages for reporting, people were apprehensive, but now I am recognized as the radio woman. She became so popular that at one point she contested an election to the local body a few years back as an independent candidate with a radio as her election symbol. Of course, she lost the election, which is another story about elections in this country. I mean, Kailash here probably knows more about it than I do. And she says it is radio that taught me how to interact with people and gave me the confidence to move outside our home, I presume. If not for it, I would have remained behind my veil and sat at home, she adds. This second story, throughout this talk, I'll try to bring in some international experiences from the work we have done elsewhere, outside India, and also India, of course. The second story I have is of Tom Boya Odiambo, who is the station manager of Koch FM, a community radio station located in the Korogocho area, one of the largest slum settlements outside Nairobi in Kenya. The slum evolved through the 60s and 70s as city administrators of Nairobi cleaned up the city and resettled large number of working class families in that area. For a couple of decades since then, Korogocho earned a reputation, not entirely unfairly, as a place for violent crime and all kinds of unsavory activities. As someone who was raised in the Korogocho settlement, Tom was involved in community organizing around civic education and legal rights of the residents. Koch FM was born out of that experience of Tom. Launched in 2006, this so-called ghetto radio station runs out of a shipment container, these long wooden crates, donated by a Norwegian aid agency. It was felt that such a structure would not only be cheaper, but also blends in well with the deprived environs of the slum. Yeah. With the inspiration of Tom and his colleagues, Nairobi then saw the emergence of as many as 4 ghetto radio stations. Today, Tom and his band of volunteers use the radio station to campaign against corruption, promote democracy and local governance, and citizen participation in the Korogocho area. It encourages local musical talents, contributes to building self-esteem and confidence among the youth of Korogocho. My third story is not on community radio but community video, on which also we do some work, although my remarks today are mostly to do with community radio. This boy Mankumar, when we worked with him closely, was a 17-year-old from village Batauli in the Sarguja district of Chhattisgarh. His father, an alcoholic, died when he was in the 5th standard, and his mother worked as an agricultural laborer. He himself was a construction worker. And so he used to be up every morning at 6 and walk down his field near his house with some Sarguja remixed numbers playing on his cheap Chinese mobile. So Sarguja is the local language. He cycles 30 kilometers back and forth to the construction site and works for about 8 hours to earn about 200 rupees a day. Mankumar has been a participant in our project, which was led by my colleague Vasuki here, in which we worked with about 20 odd tribal school students in the deprived region of Sarguja in Chhattisgarh, training them in using video to tell stories about their own lives and livelihoods, as well as the problems of the village and their neighborhoods. Mankumar and other young people in the project have learned to shoot and edit and make short films. They have gradually formed a video news group of their own, called it Sangwari Khabariya, meaning neighborhood news. It's now available as a YouTube channel. So Mankumar, highlighted the issue of polluted water in his village as his first assignment. According to him, every year a lot of people fall ill in his village because of polluted water. This is my last story, and then I'll pull back and draw some general ideas from this. Uh, this young woman, Sumi Akhtar, is a shy 13-year-old who volunteers at Radio Bikrampur in the Munshiganj district of Bangladesh. She belongs to the nomadic snake charmer community of Bede. Earlier, she didn't go to school. She would sit for hours on a boat watching children go to school and come back while she kept herself busy making fishing nets. She would listen to Radio Bikrampur on her mobile while doing her work. A chance discussion with one of the station staff and a hesitant visit to the station a little later, Sumi joined the station as a volunteer and after a week's training became a radio broadcaster. 1 week's training, not a MA in communication for 2 years. She now hosts a show on women's rights called Jago Bhogini, Awake Women, and recognized locally as a representative of child rights and women's rights. She says her program contributed to reducing the incidence of child marriage locally. She also wants to focus on the safety, security, health and hygiene of her Bede community to which she belongs. She now goes to school, doing quite well in her studies and dreams to be a teacher one day. Okay, I mean, one of the things that, on which we premise some of this work on community media is globalization and media globalization. So with the advancement of technology all around us in a globalized world, media are looked upon both as facilitating globalization and being affected and transformed by its perpetuation. As an industry, the media have gained much from globalization as they don't have to deal with traditional political boundaries and are able to reach a wider market to create profits. Scholars concerned about cultural sovereignty, cultural rights contend that media globalization has contributed to a one-way transmission of ideas and values that result in the displacement of, for example, indigenous cultures. The strongest culture that globalized media may be credited with establishing is one that considers generating consumption as an overarching virtue and thereby turns media content into a commodity. And media organizations as producers of content that grab maximum audiences. The outcome of this is the homogenization of media output across the world, guided by economies of scale and profit maximization. So even if there are multiple outlets of media and heterogenization by way of culturally customized content to cater to local ethos, much of the grammar, constructs and methods of organizing and creating media are such that they feed into the globalized corporate structure. Moreover, the production values of a globalized marketplace and vertical integration aided by cross-media ownership. I mean, those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, I mean, this is about, one single company owning several media outlets across, right? I mean, same group owning a radio station, a TV channel, a newspaper and a magazine and a film production company and so on. Rupert Murdoch, who is caricatured in that, is an example. Yeah. So this oligopolistic control of all media and communication channels by big multinational companies results in a democracy deficit. Hence, an analysis of media globalization compels one to problematize this issue. Who do global media speak to? And what do they speak about? Are there any communicative spaces that remain open to be used for progressive social change? What purpose do media serve in making this world a more conducive place to live for those at the margins of development and human rights? Is globalized media and advancement of communication technology catering only to those with political or economic clout? Social change advocates are articulating that the progressive development potential of media must not be lost, and there ought to be spaces to generate content that are change oriented, that are locally relevant, socially responsible, as well as culturally rooted. Popular and community based media, such as local newspapers, community radio, participatory video, popular theatre, independent documentaries, are some of the significant alternatives that are looked upon as social change media that cater to people at the grassroots, that are produced by people at the grassroots. Yeah? These are the people who remain unrepresented in this era of media globalization. So we are talking about the kind of people that I talked about initially. Yeah? Okay, let me move on to this issue of vulnerability. I mean, the big vulnerability we are looking at, amidst all the other vulnerabilities I'll mention, is what we call voice poverty. Yeah? Now, the migrant labor crisis brought on by the unprecedented, sudden and harsh lockdown restrictions that were imposed by the government of India to deal with the spread of COVID-19 has indeed, stirred all our conscience. The nation sat up and took notice. Much has been written about the precarious economic conditions of the migrant workers and the misery, starvation, death caused by the severe disruption in their lives and livelihoods. However, one of the little understood issues underlying the relative powerlessness with which lakhs of these workers just started walking back long distances to their villages rather than mount any form of serious resistance in the very cities that they have built and sustained over the years is what some scholars have called their voice poverty. And others have described it in terms of deep communication inequalities and what some other scholars have called discursive erasures. Yeah? So there are some scholars who have talked about it. Joe Taki, who is a long-time observer of the South Asian community media scene, a major scholar of communication and social change, defines voice poverty as the inability of people to influence decisions that affect their lives. Yeah, that is voice poverty. And the right to participate in that decision making. Yeah. So denial of voice comes from systematic efforts to restrict access to modes of self-expression. Another scholar, Nick Cowdery, talks about the human capacity to give account of themselves and of their place in the world. It is important to have a voice and to know that this voice matters. Treating people as if they lack that capacity is to treat them as if they were not human. The past century or so provides many shameful examples of this all over the world. I don't need to run through that list. Voice is one word for that capacity, but having a voice is never enough, according to Cowdery. I need to know that my voice matters. Right? The offer of effective voice is crucial to the legitimacy of modern democracies. Yet we have grown used to ways of organizing things that ignore voice, that assumes voice doesn't matter. We are experiencing a contemporary crisis of voice across political, economic, and cultural domains that has been growing for at least last 3 or 4 decades. As Nick Cowdery has pointed out, the problem is not just the obliteration of spaces for articulating one's voices, but also the lack of recognition or utter disregard for the voices of the poor and disenfranchised in the context of neoliberal economics and politics. There is an urgent need to address not only poverty, but also voice poverty. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur famously said, "We have no idea what a culture would be where no one any longer knew what it meant to narrate things." Yeah, if people don't have the spaces to narrate themselves, their lives, what kind of lives would they be leading? The capability to narrate oneself is linked to the capacity to consider oneself as an active subject, And the recognition of this basic capability by both the individual and the community defines the opportunities of the human flourishing. Yeah? So, importance of testimonies, oral histories are all about this narrative imperative. Yeah? So, it is in this context that the emergence of voice infrastructures or infrastructures of knowledge production for, of, and by marginalized communities gains importance. Starting from the Bolivian miners' radio in the 1940s, small scale local community radio stations now have a considerable presence across the world in Latin America, Africa, Australia, Europe, North America, and Asia, of course. Estimates vary, but their overall numbers are certainly in the thousands, waging a battle in each of these regions to carve out a subaltern public sphere, independent of the dominant public sphere, where the government controlled and private commercial media have a hegemonic control over public discourse. Yeah, this is, I'm sorry, I don't know if it's very clear, but this is just a little mapping of these multiple vulnerabilities that I had mentioned in my title. So people feel vulnerable in terms of the kind of precarious livelihoods they have, their assets. People feel vulnerable in terms of the places they live, geographically isolated, unserviced by things like public health, education. People feel vulnerable in terms of their bodies, hungry, exhausted, sick. There are gender vulnerabilities, security, and so on. Yeah, the organizations of the poor are weak, disconnected, so they also feel powerless to articulate their concerns and their identities in an effective manner. So, community media of the kind that I'm talking about emerge out of the sort of intersections of all of these multiple vulnerabilities. We are not talking just about economic poverty. That, of course, is one of the core things, but not just that. Yeah. There are people whose communities are grossly underrepresented and sidelined by the mainstream media. These communities are locationally disadvantaged, live in the hinterland, deprived of adequate and timely information. Moreover, there is linguistic marginalization of these communities, and that linguistic marginalization is such that they receive very little communication in their own languages and dialects, some of which are even outside the purview of state recognition. So in the remaining time, I'm just going to flag two such vulnerabilities, some of the things that we do at the UNESCO Chair on Community Media, on language vulnerability and climate vulnerability, and quickly go through these two kinds of vulnerabilities and say a little bit about how community media tries to address these concerns. So the last couple of years with the COVID-19 context, if you look at it, Latin America, for example, gives us a lot of interesting examples of how this sort of linguistic vulnerability was addressed at a particularly physically vulnerable period for a lot of communities, with the virus. In Peru, where disinformation and conspiracy theories have led to very low uptake of vaccination, especially among indigenous communities, a station in the province of Nauta devoted a good part of its programming to receiving calls from community members, directing queries about vaccines to state authorities, and broadcasting authenticated information on COVID-19. One of the challenges was that much of the health department's audio messages were made only in Spanish and had to be translated into a number of native indigenous languages. Similar work was reported in other parts of Latin America, like in Nicaragua, and in Costa Rica and so on, converting official government health information into indigenous languages on such matters as proper wearing of masks, social distancing measures, and addressing unfounded rumors on the pandemic. In the Amazon rainforest of Ecuador, far from healthcare facilities, conveying information about COVID vaccinations in the Quechua language meant that isolated indigenous communities were brought into the communication loop. Yeah, so that was an important thing. So I could go on giving you a lot of other examples from places like Mexico, where a network of community radio stations, 22 community radio stations, came together and translated a lot of this information into a number of indigenous languages. If you look at the Indian context of linguistic vulnerability and community radio, following the 1971 census, the Indian government declared that any language with less than 10,000 speakers need not be on the list of recognized languages. Because of this, all languages spoken in India by less than 10,000 people are considered to be possibly endangered by UNESCO. While undertaking the People's Linguistic Survey of India in 2010, the well-known linguist G.N. Devi recorded 780 Indian languages, of which 600 were on the list of vanishing languages. He also found that over the previous 60 years, close to 250 languages had already perished in India. Now there are 350 some CR stations, community radio stations in India. A majority are located in rural hinterlands, broadcast in various languages and local dialects. Yeah? Thereby giving these communities an opportunity to express their views and express their identities. Located at the margins and catering to specific socially and culturally vulnerable communities, community radios are considered an important voice infrastructure, especially for people who speak and live with marginal languages, including indigenous communities. So the big shift from Hindi in All India Radio and in the regionally dominant languages broadcasting from regional capitals to the more polyphonic, multilingual world of community radios. So today, among the 350 stations, you will get stations that speak in the Telangana Telugu. You have stations that broadcast in Kutchi, Bundeli, Santhali, and so on. Yeah, languages that you don't normally get to hear on mainstream media, including All India Radio and other broadcast channels. One little anecdote about Radio Bundelkhand, which brings home this the impact of something like this. Radio Bundelkhand, located not too far from Jhansi railway station. Bundelkhand is a particularly economically deprived region. When they started their station, in the first year or two, they ran something called the Bundeli Idol competition. All of you are familiar with the Indian Idol and so on. And they invited people in the community to come to the station to sing songs in the Bundeli language. Yeah, and that there would be a competition and somebody will be declared a Bundeli Idol. They thought they'll run it for 2-3 days. But so many people came forward to sing in the Bundeli language. People were bringing harvest season songs, songs from weddings and funerals and so on. It went on and on for about a month. Yeah? They eventually declared somebody a Bundeli Idol. That was beside the point. But the station actually ended up with a very rich digital archive of Bundeli cultural artifact, which they still play in their station now, right? So that's, I think, one of the significant things that's been done. Another station in West Bengal called Nityanand Janamani works almost exclusively with Santhali community. So Santali language is heard on the radio airwaves perhaps for the first time in India. Yeah, again, it has some powerful consequences. In 2019, when the UNESCO Chair on Community Media did some work with the Election Commission of India, we had a project called Festival of Democracy, where we were asked to work with local radio stations to generate content on voter education, electoral literacy, and so on. And we said they will not deal with centralized content, they will produce their own content and in their own languages. So we worked with about 25 stations across the country, and they produced overall about 100 hours of content in 11 of the main languages in India, but also in Bundeli, in Kutchi, in Marwadi, in Santali, in Saharia, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and it had some really powerful effect for residents of these communities to listen to information about electoral literacy, voter education, how to register for your vote, and so on in their own languages. Most recently, we have come across something called Asur Radio in Jharkhand. Asur is a small community, small tribal community, and there is an Asur language, which has maybe a couple of thousand speakers now. Yeah, and that's also on the endangered languages list. They have now recently started something called Asur Radio. And groups like the Jharkhandi Bhasha Sanskriti Akhada, the Asur Adivasi Wisdom Akhada, and so on came together to launch this initiative. While they are still waiting for a radio license, they do something very interesting. They take this radio content that they produce together to the weekly markets, to the public marketplaces, and play this over the loudspeakers. Yeah, talking of the Habermasian public sphere, here is something very interesting that they are trying out. Yeah, and we are beginning to do some work with that community. Okay, let me move on to my second and last example of the kind of vulnerability which is being taken on by community radios all over the world, which is climate vulnerability. Yeah. Events over the past years have made clear that no one can escape the impacts of climate change. I mean, we have seen Bangalore, Chennai, and so on recently. However, at the global level, climate effects are not uniform. There are several reports and studies that indicate that the poorest countries of the world, while registering the lowest industrial pollution levels, are most susceptible to the damage produced by climate change. And within national boundaries, it's usually the poor and the deprived, people who live in forest areas, suffering the impacts of deforestation, people who live in areas which experience frequent flooding, right? They are the ones who face most of the effects of climate change. So certain social groups are particularly vulnerable to crisis fostered by climate change. People with disabilities, indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, landless tenants, migrant workers, displaced people, sexual and gender minorities, older people, socially marginalized groups. I mean, over and over again, studies are showing us this. Now, there are examples from Africa. For example, in Ghana, people taking on this issue, working with poor farmers to talk about their experiences of climate change, and older community members talking about their experience 40, 50 years back and what is happening today. So there's a lot of peer-to-peer learning that happens in these stations. So Ghana is one place where there was a major project called Climate Airwaves, where a number of radio stations came together to produce content and broadcast about climate change and its impact. So one of the things that is happening here is the reversal of a certain kind of knowledge reversal. a certain kind of epistemological hierarchies where knowledge is expert driven and passed on to the ignorant masses who apparently don't know anything. That's being reversed. People's knowledge is being valued, respected, and somebody who has been doing farming for 40, 50 years throughout his life, it's acknowledged that they know a thing or two about farming, and don't have to necessarily learn all the time from agricultural university products, who just are fresh out of college. Now, in India too, and in South Asia, there's a lot of this work that is happening with community radio stations. Bangladesh, which is flood prone, disaster prone region, a number of community radio stations again and again, step in whenever there is a major disaster to talk about disaster mitigation work, how to build climate resilient communities, over a period of time. In India, we have examples in Tamil Nadu, people who have dealt with Cyclone Gaja. There is a radio station in Nagapattinam in Tamil Nadu called Kalanjam Radio. Kalanjam was set up actually after the 2004 tsunami. So they work with fisher folk, and their main work is about making that community more resilient to climate change impact. In Bundelkhand again, 5 stations came together in a project called Shubh Kal, and a couple of years ago they produced something like 35 to 40 hours of content that was broadcast throughout the year about agriculture, living in arid regions, how to do dryland agriculture, and so on and so forth. Again, not the kind of content you will get to see in a more homogeneous, all India radio kind of situation. So, just this kind of two examples, both in terms of linguistic vulnerability, of course, cuts across whatever content that they are producing. Much of it is using those kinds of local endangered languages. So, finally, just to draw some overall conclusions about it. The work of community media, whether it is video or radio or other forms of community communication, they are all addressing, ways of achieving some kind of community equity, communicative equity for the vulnerable. We have already talked about voice poverty, how their voices are not heard. I think it was Arundhati Roy who famously said, she hates the term voiceless because nobody is really voiceless. It's only that there are unheard voices. We don't care to listen and we don't recognize their voices. So how do we create voice infrastructures that address these vulnerable communities who suffer from these multiple vulnerabilities? Building people's capacities, building self-reliance to ensure that these vulnerable communities learn to use the media rather than be used by the media. Is one of the things that we take as our mantra at the UNESCO chair. I've already mentioned Vasuki's work here with these Adivasi children in Chhattisgarh, but we have done things like that in different parts of the country. Teaching people how to do radio, and we realized, people understand that it's no rocket science. It's only that they have never had access to tools of, narration. So once they have access, it takes a few days to learn how to handle a microphone, a few more days to learn how to do recording, how to edit, and so on. And the rest they will learn on the job. So capacity building self-reliant communities is one of the important pathways towards building communicative equity for the vulnerable. And this is based on principles of dialogue and deliberation. This is not a one way, top down kind of communication from the powerful to the powerless, uh, from the rich to the poor, but a lot of it is about horizontal communication, people speaking with each other, yeah, through dialogue, through deliberation, uh, participatory ethos. People like Paulo Freire in Latin America have talked about this for a long time, right? Uh, Pedagogical approaches that uh, take on for themselves how to teach communities, and the assumption is communities know nothing, right? Uh, this kind of work brings a certain kind of cognitive respect and tries to achieve some epistemic justice, that people's knowledge, what people know, get some respect in the kind of social change and development work that you do. And more importantly, in the media content that you produce, that their knowledge becomes part of it. And for this, we need certain processes, certain kinds of practices, certain kinds of policies, processes that allow people to speak for themselves and their issues, not being represented by however well intentioned people are, but people have the spaces and learn to articulate for themselves what they want to say. Practices that enable individuals, organizations, and communities to learn to use media rather than be used by the media. I've already said that a little while ago. Finally, we also need policies. Some of our work at the UNESCO Chair on Community Media is about policy advocacy. Policies that provide an enabling framework for multiple voices to flourish, especially of those who are at the margins. So, for example, the community radio policy in the country, our team and our department played a big role in drafting the very first version of the National Community Radio Policy, right? And we keep interjecting with our own policy recommendations about how to make it more democratic, more open-ended, and so on. So I'll stop here. Thanks for being here quite late, and thanks for paying attention. If you have questions, comments, I'll be happy to take. Thank you. Is there a mic or something? Is it on? Yeah. Yeah, maybe we can hear you.
I'm not sure how much this has to do with community radio as such, but during the pandemic, there was this popularity of this app called Clubhouse, in which you could express your thoughts without necessarily showing your face, and people could also listen and maybe respond to what the speakers have to say. And there were virtual chat rooms in many Indian languages, not just the most spoken ones such as Hindi and Telugu. And at least in the chat rooms where songs were being sung, people who did not speak the language would also attend. And they would, even though they may not understand, they would still try to get an idea of what was going on. And topics that did not get much attention in mainstream media, such as alternate sexualities, for example, and such topics would be discussed by people from the LGBT community again, because here they have the option to not reveal themselves, and they could also address questions that other people had. So even though such media platforms are not without their problems, and people have raised concerns regarding reliability, but still,
What would be the most fundamental problem with platforms like that in the places that I'm talking about?
you don't have smartphones. Or internet connections. But I was wondering, at least in the context of India, would it help in decentralizing the the media, the power from the mainstream media platforms. At least some of people who have internet access.
Yeah. No, there are lots of exciting things happening to decentralize media to a great extent using internet and mobile phones and so on. But if you look at the harsh fact that we are looking at something like 40% people who have access to the internet in India, large numbers of people still no connectivity, in spite of digital India and the dreams that brings. So me and my colleagues still hold on to analog quite desperately. I mean, we are among the last of the analog missionaries, you can say. And I think we need to leverage analog technologies still as much as possible, while, where possible, exploit some of those kinds of possibilities. I mean, I know, for example, friends in Africa have used this app, which some of you may not know, on Radio Garden during the pandemic. Yeah? Radio Garden basically curates a number of local radio stations on a platform, and many of them were uploading content that others could download and play on their radio station and so on. So again, connectivity is the key, but where that was possible, they did use those kinds of technologies. And of course, the pandemic brought tremendous amount of innovation in this sector, in community radio. People couldn't go to their radio stations. People were doing interviews online, on the phone, recording it on their mobile phone, trying to upload to the radio station in all kinds of interesting ways. We ourselves did a couple of workshops for radio stations in Bangladesh and Mongolia about how to leverage social media for community radio in an effective fashion. If you have connectivity, how could you use YouTube, Facebook, WhatsApp, and so on more effectively? Something that we have done. But you're right. Yeah, I mean, some of these new digital technologies do open up some possibilities.
My question is probably of a conceptual nature. We talk about voice quality and we also talk about providing voice infrastructure. Now, this is the realm of the tangible, of the concrete. What happens when something will be also affected by what we are seeing all around them, the aspiration, what value of what's happening in the city, and they themselves forget certain aspects of their culture. So, for example, there have been studies in which children of indigenous tribes have forgotten half the medicinal plants that so that is also a kind of a voice problem.
That's a running battle for many of these communities, especially becomes a intergenerational challenge. No, I mean, many of these farmers who are trying to protect their unique crops, millets and so on, are anxious that their children are not into it. What happens to this knowledge? I mean, that's a very typical kind of an example. But at the same time, I mean, we also need to be a bit careful about valorizing, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge beyond a point. Because like all knowledge systems, they are also amenable to constant evolution and challenges, and things evolve over a period of time. I mean, these are not knowledge systems locked up in a museum. Yeah, I mean, so we shouldn't be museumizing or fossilizing these kinds of vibrant cultures, right? So they do take on a different form and content over a period of time. But yeah, it is a constant challenge how to protect, preserve, but also keep them dynamic as living cultures. Anything else?
I have a question. So, this is not analog, but if you look at outlets such as Khabar Lahariya, for example, who've been popular in the last few months.
Cover Lahariya started as a very much in the analog world.
Okay.
It was a community newspaper.
Right, yes, correct. My question is rather, do you think that these grassroots initiatives need to at some point collaborate with media outlets that have some clout? Because Khabar Lahariya also ran a couple of articles or more in the wire representing
Yeah.
Khabar Lahariya, because of which they shot into fame. Recently, they produced India's first, I don't know if it's India's first, but probably India's first grassroots level comic on comic completely by gay and the queer community, and I think around Bundelkhand and the other places where it was originally based out of. But they definitely became very popular once they started collaborating with, or once they started establishing themselves on the digital platform. So, apart from basic things like setting up infrastructure and actually establishing community radio stations, do you think that at some point there has to be some sort of intervention by the major media houses?
No, I mean, Cover Lahariya is an interesting example of the way some of these media initiatives could evolve. They didn't start with being online, and they didn't start with videos and so on. I mean, they used to handwrite their reports in the very early years. That I think one of our students did a PhD on Cover Lahariya. Yeah, and it also required certain kinds of interventions by people sitting in Bombay to do the editing, to set up networks, right? So it requires certain wider kinds of coordinations and networking, which is okay, but that they evolve. In fact, some friends of mine in Delhi now who run this organization called Digital Empowerment Foundation, DEF, are now actually experimenting with community-based internet networks. With a Mexican model that they have using to create some kind of a mesh antenna and so on, so that you can opt out of the Geos and the Tatas and whatever, and to set up community-owned networks, right? Now, if you can get both the last mile connectivity in the hands of communities, then there are interesting possibilities that open up, right? Otherwise, you are taking communities right into the hands of the Metas and the YouTubes and so on. Of course, now Twitter, going in all kinds of crazy directions. Yeah, but yeah, Khabar Lahariya is an interesting example. There is also that other rural newspaper, no? What is that called? Gaon Connection. Yeah, Gaon Connection is another newspaper which has now become quite popular, and also now they embed videos and all that in their. They have a website. There are. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Arvind.
Was just since you saw so many of these stations worldwide, do these distinguish among each other in some fashion? So, what are those features that will tell about one is different from the other, as opposed to all of them being seen as just a radio station?
No, I mean they are very heterogeneous. I mean, in their character, in the way they are funded, in the way they function. So some of the things I have said probably are in terms of an ideal type community radio, and I'm sure many stations are not quite there. Some are there and beyond. I mean, some of them do fantastic work. I mean, this community radio station in Nepal, in the Kathmandu Valley, during the height of the monarchy's crackdown on democracy, the royal edict said, "You shall not read news on air." This station sang the news. Now, I mean, that took a lot of courage to be able to do that, and they did it for a whole month. They just kept singing the news because they were told only not to read the news. Now, how many stations push the envelope like that for democracy, for human rights, is one of the things that we are grappling with, at least in India. Many of the stations are quite embedded in a much safer developmental paradigm rather than democracy, communication rights, human rights kind of paradigm. If you look at Latin America, they're very embedded in social movements, human rights movements, pro-democracy movements, very radical. You don't find that in India, right? I mean, very, very developmentalist because of our own trajectory of NGOs and so on. Somewhere we have written, I have a paper about the development trap in which community radio stations have fallen in India. In India, for example, we can't broadcast news. The policy prohibits community radio stations from broadcasting news. When I tell this to people I met in West Africa, they have asked me, so what do they do if they don't do news? So for some of them, news is such an important ingredient. Local news, locally relevant news and information. But some of our stations are very creative, very innovative. They'll get around the ban. They do something, but they don't call it news. So the problem is only when you say, here is today's samachar or whatever, right? If you don't do that, there are creative ways in which people get around. So this station in Telangana has a show where two women sit together in the studio. They are chatting like sisters-in-law in a rural joint family. All the men folk apparently have gone for the day's agriculture. And these two women are sitting and gossiping about the village and the neighborhood. The whole thing, it's called Muchaklu something. Yaranla Muchaklu. Sisters-in-law's gossip. That's literally what it is, right? And they are giving news of the neighborhood. You know what happened, that farmer committed suicide the other day, that kind of thing, right? But it's not news. So some of them are creative. They get around this kind of ban. I already gave you the example of Bundelkhand Radio that came up with, that actually co-opted a dominant, television format into a community format and did some amazing things there, right? So people do think on their feet, they are creative, innovative, but there is a whole range. In India, all community radio stations are owned by NGOs or educational institutions like ours. Yeah? So when you say community-owned media, the question is, which community owns, it's a very nebulous kind of a term, right? So NGOs on behalf of the community then own the radio station. And it comes with its own issues and problems. You go to Europe, community radio stations are very tied into anti-race movements, LGBTQ movements, and so on. You go to a station in Hamburg, there are huge signs outside that says, refugees welcome. So you get Somalian refugees in the thick of winter walking into that radio station, chatting about their problems and so on. So something like that you can't imagine much in the Indian context. So each societal, socio-political context throws up its own variety of community radio stations. But underlying all of that is some attempt to address or mitigate this voice poverty that I was talking about. So shall we stop there? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all for coming here.
Thank you, Professor Pavarala. We learned quite a bit from your talk about various community media and how they address multiple vulnerabilities and how we can learn about multiple vulnerabilities just by looking at how they function. To wrap up the session, may I now invite Dr. Sharadendu Bhattacharya from the Department of English to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Professor Pavarala, for that wonderfully informative as well as engaging session. Thanks also to Professor Nair for organizing this first lecture in a series of lectures that we hope to be able to participate in. I also thank the administrative staff of the university and the department and the school, of course, as well as the technical crew for making this possible for us to host it. Thanks also to all the audience members for participating in such a lively fashion, and to Professor Pavarala again for giving us such wonderful insights into the possibilities of community radio and the pertinent question of voice poverty. Thank you so much.